I'm just suddenly still as lacquered straw while the blackbirds along the fence line pivoted as one to stare, beaks pointing at the old cedar post where she hung, wrists bound in a knot an old-timer might have called a prayer if he'd forgotten how to pray. And Jesse Holt, who did not spook easy in the dark and did not believe in the old names his daddy kept in a coffee tin, along with rusted nails and bits of horsehair, felt it anyway. A hush parting the day. A shape leaning over his shoulder that wasn't there, but made the bridge of his nose ache like when he'd been out in hard glare too long. And he said, "Bait for what?" Because there wasn't another soul for 10 miles. Only the burned-out windmill throwing its shadow over cracked dirt and the fence singing one long note like a bowed saw. And she lifted her face out of the hair plastered to it, and he saw not beauty, but the stubborn look of somebody who had stood in a field and waited for rain that never came. Brown eyes fixed not on him but on something past his shoulder, and she said, "For you, for it, for whatever moves when people cut things that shouldn't be cut." And he told himself he was a godforsaken fool because it surely was a trap. Rustlers, maybe, or javelinas trained to come at the smell of fresh blood. But he moved without thinking. Knife out, the polished antler handle warm against his palm because his father's hand had worn it that way, and she flinched at the glint of it and said soft, "Don't," in a voice like a bottle rolling under the porch, and he said, "Hush now," because he'd never left anyone tied to bake on a fence, not even an enemy. And he set the blade to the rope and pulled, and the fibers parted with a sound as intimate as paper, tearing in a church. And then Jesse Holt, the last Holt left on a ranch that had cost his mother her breath and his father his stubbornness and his brother his sense, stared in horror because the rope didn't fall. It uncurled like something alive, 1,000 tiny splinters of fiber writhing as if breathing for the first time. The cedar post gave a slow exhale as if relieved, and somewhere on the far side of the stock pond a chorus of frogs that hadn't sung since last spring began to warble all at once, only the sound wasn't water true. It was like an old record played too slow. And the sky, God help him, the sky, seemed to peel, blue bending into a bruised yellow at the edges as if someone had pressed a thumb to the evening and smudged it, and the blackbirds lifted silently and turned the other way, facing the house now. Facing the long dirt track, facing home like sentries switching sides. She stumbled forward free, and he reached to catch her, but she didn't want catching. She gathered herself with a grimace and stepped back to the fence, clutching her wrists, and said, "You weren't supposed to be first." And when he said, "First what?" she only stared past him again and whispered, "First to cut." He looked down at the rope, at the bright pale wound where his knife had kissed it, and saw what he should have seen before. The strands weren't just sisal. They were braided with hair, coarse and dark and threaded with gray, and with something else that glittered faintly, like ground rock salt or crushed bone. And the knot he'd severed had been tied in a way that looped back into itself twice, a lariat of intention. And in the dust at his boots were little shapes he couldn't name. Half footprints, half the suggestion that something standing there wasn't standing so much as borrowing the idea of standing. And his throat clicked, dry as he swallowed, because his father had told him once, leaning back on a porch rail while the heat pressed them both into silence. A fence is to keep what you love where you can see it, and to keep what you don't from learning your steps. Some fence is wood and wire, and some fence is something else. The woman, she was maybe 25, maybe 30. Ranch years made everyone look older, turned and pressed her palms flat to the cedar post like a penitent to an altar and said, "We can still fix it if we hurry." And Jesse found himself saying, "We?" because he had not planned on a we that day or any day since burying his father. And she gave him her name without looking back. Mara then added, "Run if you want, Holt, but you'll only be running inside it." And that sentence was a thing he did not understand until he turned in a full circle and saw that the fence his great-granddaddy had laid in an imperfect rectangle, cut drunken by the land, by the stream and the rocky hillside, now seemed to lean toward a circle, not by moving posts but by the lay of light itself. And he thought of a child drawing a sun and then deciding, no, it should be a coin, and pushing the crayon until the serrations blurred. He had once believed his place was tired, long since eaten to the bone by drought and debt, only good for cows too thin and a man too stubborn. but now he saw the pasture the way a hawk might, edges bowing inward like the skin of a drum, and something beat against it, seeking the seam his knife had made. Mara looked at his hand and the knife still in it and said, "She told you never to cut it, didn't he?" And Jesse bristled at the pronoun slip until he realized she'd said he, and he remembered a winter night when Ephraim Holt had dragged him out in his socks, breath smoking, to show him how frost outlines the secrets of fences, how the corners glitter heavier when something leans from the other side, and had said, "If you ever come on a rope that looks like it doesn't belong to nothing, son, you leave it, because it belongs to everything." He slid the knife back in its sheath with a motion that felt like it deserved an apology and said, "What is it?" And she laughed without mirth and said, "Depends on which granny you ask. Mine called it the loose, because it is most itself when something like you sets it loose." He started to say he didn't believe in that. Didn't believe in anything. That couldn't be fixed with a shovel or a rifle or a call to Buddy Cooper at the county. But the fence sang again. Higher now. The note of a green bottle rim flicked by a dirty finger, and the grass on the far slope lifted against the wind, every blade going the wrong way, and his cattle in the cut below all turned their heads at once like synchronized swimmers and stared without blinking, and one of the calves opened its mouth to bawl, but nothing came out. Only a thin thread of steam that went straight up and then bent, sharply, toward the line he'd cut. Mara dug in her dress pocket and pulled out a short piece of the same rope, untied, and a small tin of something powdery that smelled like old pennies and cedar shavings, and said, "There are 9 knots on this place that matter, 8 to say no and 1 to say stay, and the 9th's a life, so hurry." And she thrust the rope into his hands, and the dust caked in the creases of his knuckles stung like it had memory, and she was already moving, walking the fence fast, counting under her breath, not 1, 2, 3, but something like a lullaby. Scrambled, sundown, moonkeep, door shut, shade sleep, and he went after her because the alternative was to stand on a warm piece of earth and be part of it in the wrong way. They ran the line like that, making clumsy old man knots with his big rancher's hands while she then undid them and retied with a precision that put a quiet into the fence, each knot laid with a smear of that powder and a whisper of breath. And by the 3rd knot the quiet had become a pressure, a palm against his forehead, and he heard someone call his name with his mother's voice even though she'd been dead 15 years. "Jesse, where's your hat?" she said, exactly as she always had, impatient and kind, and he nearly turned his head toward the house the way a child obeys the familiar music of home. But Mara caught his chin with 2 fingers and pushed his face back to the fence and said, "Don't look. It uses the seams we leave open," and he gritted his teeth and said, "They're not seams, that's my life you're calling seams." And her eyes flicked to him then with something almost like pity, and almost like anger, and said, "All our lives are seams to something hungry. Tie." And he tied. At the 5th knot the singing turned to a deep thrum that made his molars vibrate, and the light went strange, bending around fence posts so their shadows lay in curls like sleeping cats, and a shape moved along the ridge beyond the stock pond, tall, and narrow and wrong in the way a man seems wrong when he's trying to be a scarecrow, sliding between cottonwoods that should have been too close together for anything to fit. And still he and Mara worked, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on their temples, her lips moving like a child saying grace, and the cattle began to back away 1 step at a time without looking, their hooves barely kissing the ground like they were rehearsing how to be ghosts. At the 7th knot by the twisted mesquite his brother had nearly set on fire in a Navajo churro foolishness, Mara's breath hitched, and she pressed his hand longer than the knot needed, and he knew before she spoke that she'd been keeping the last of it, the worst of it, and she said, "You've guessed some of it already, Jesse Holt. We don't tie ourselves to posts because we owe you charity. We tie ourselves because someone made a contract long before either of us was breathing, and it's not the kind of contract you write down. It's the kind you make with footsteps and decisions and land that knows your name. And the last knot is a person. It won't hold if it's unloved. It won't hold if it's unwilling. It won't hold if it can't learn the shape of your shadow." And he felt a cold anger bloom under his ribs, a clean thing, cutting, and said, "So you were bait for me?" And she said, "Yes, and for it. It watches kindness the way coyotes watch lambing pens." And he said,